And so I will talk about my research that I've done over the past decade or more into Azerbaijan's erasure of the entire medieval Armenian heritage in Nakhichevan. The title may sound sensational, but wait until the end of the presentation. There is nothing sensational except the actual crime and the cover-up that they did in this land, in this former part of the Armenian homeland, which is exactly, as I mentioned earlier, what Artsakh has tried to avoid. And as I talk about my journey into investigating this destruction, let's go to 2013 to North Iran. Here's the border with Azerbaijan, with Nakhichevan. Across the border, where that flat field is, the view was supposed to be magical. I know it because my father visited there. Back then, it was the Soviet Union's southwestern edge. My father was not allowed to take photographs, but others before and after have. There, you had thousands of sacred burial monuments, khachkars. They depicted biblical scenes, medieval life, and the mystical double-bodied Sphinx. Beneath rested visionary merchants whose lasting legacies include Europe's first cafes and Captain Kidd's pirated loot. This was Julfa, the world's largest medieval Armenian cemetery. At its height, there were 10,000 khachkars. By the 1980s, 3,000 remained, yet it still was the largest field of crossstones in the world. I was 19 in December 2005 when I heard of the destruction of Julfa. An Armenian priest in North Iran had gone to the border and videotaped 200 soldiers of Azerbaijan smashing the remaining stones with sledgehammers, dumping it into the river Araxes. Within weeks, centuries of history was erased. Because it looks so awkward to have freshly flattened earth on an international border which is not suited for anything, they had to create this temporary rifle range to rationalize their actions. But when I went there in 2013, it was no longer there. I was horrified. I was upset that Armenia's response was timid, that Azerbaijan was denying it, and worse so, that the world was doing nothing. So this became my cause. Within a year, with help from a lot of people, especially a young student by the name of Sarah Pickman, we produced a documentary called The New Tears of Araxes. Actually, Aram Hamparian, sitting right here, had sent me the CD with the footage of the destruction, after which I connected with the priest and got further permission to use it. Then I published an article I'd written in undergraduate school. My professor was Glenn Morris, famous from the militant American Indian movement. And he was like, why don't you submit this to, large paper? I said, well, I'm in my early 20s, I'm not a scholar, but apparently you don't have to mention those things. And so I published the article in 2007 in the world's leading historical magazine, History Today. The next thing, again, with a lot of help from people, was creating the website, julfa.com, that brought together all of the information on the destruction of the world's largest field of crossstones or khachkars. The next big project was convincing the American Association for the Advancement of Science to use satellite imagery to prove that the cemetery had indeed disappeared, because Azerbaijan kept denying all efforts of talking about this. They had organized a press conference when the website was launched. They always gave the country of Armenia the credit for all this work. I guess that's a compliment to the Armenian government. And so the satellite imagery came out. It was a lot of lobbying to be done, because until this, the only satellite comparisons that had been done were for human rights violations that directly targeted civilian populations. This became popular during and the aftermath of the Darfur genocide. And this was the first investigation ever into cultural destruction, which unfortunately became a very common practice when ISIS started targeting monuments in Syria and in Iraq. Then I organized this petition. Many of you probably signed it to UNESCO, asking them to act. Little did I know then that the UNESCO Director Generals were both on the payroll of Azerbaijan, and I welcome them to sue me for saying this, because I can prove that they were. That didn't help, and so I launched the Facebook page, and then I wanted to do something positive, something lasting, something that actually created something instead of talking about destruction. So I convinced the Armenian community in Colorado to do something crazy, and that's to build the first ever Armenian cross stone on the grounds of any state capital in this country. And so we rebuilt, after 4 years of work with Armenians of Colorado, one of the Julfa cross stones that had been destroyed. Thank you. That's exactly what I thought. I was like, yay, mission accomplished. I am done now to, move on to my own life, start a family, buy a townhouse, start a small real estate business so I can pay down my debt. And so I got engaged with my now wife, Angela, on January 1st, 2018, and I thought all of this was behind me. 5 days later was Armenian Christmas, and I couldn't fall asleep. I had neglected to tell the full story of Julfa. It's as if you talked about the Armenian genocide and you only talked about Deir Zor. Or if you wanted to talk about the Holocaust, but you only talked about Auschwitz. Julfa was not an isolation. It was a tiny part, even though it was the grand finale, but a small part of a huge crime against humanity. This was worse than ISIS. How come the world ignored this? How come Azerbaijan got away with this? And if I did not tell the story, who would? And would I ever forgive myself if the world never learned of the greatest cultural genocide of our time? So these were my thoughts on the Armenian Christmas, and I had to do something about this for my own conscience. This is not charity work, even though I never got paid for this or any of the people who helped me. This is, to be able to sleep well at night. And so I had to put together the best team possible, because we only had one shot to tell the story. And my co-author, Sarah Pickman, who was a student when we made the video together, is now a PhD candidate in history at Yale. We recruited reviewers, including an anonymous Azerbaijani historian who also served as an eyewitness. He saw the destruction. And many, many contributors, not just for the research, but throughout the years. 13 months later, after hundreds of sleepless nights, the article came out on February 18, 2019. A regime conceals its erasure of indigenous Armenian culture. This was actually supposed to be published in History Today. We had worked with them for an entire year. They backed out, never told us what the reason was, but we're glad it got published in the US because our editor intends to submit this for a Pulitzer for international reporting. Had it been published in London, we would not qualify for that. Here are the Armenian sites that existed in Nakhichevan. Julfa is on the lower left corner, but look at the rest of them. When you think about this destruction, don't just think of Julfa. It's not just Deir Zor. It was all over the land. And here are the sources. So we use eyewitness testimony. On the top left, we have Argam Ayvazian, the hero who spent decades documenting the Armenian monuments of Nakhichevan during the Soviet era. He himself was born there. He felt that this was going to end one day because all of his family and friends, including himself, had been forced to leave Nakhichevan. No Armenian stayed there, and he thought the same would happen to the monuments. The next person is Father or Bishop Nishan Topuzyan, who witnessed the destruction. I was also an eyewitness to what had remained. In fact, I'm standing in the foreground of a Julfa chapel built on Iran's territory, which Iran has repaired since. We have, with the backdrop of the mountain in Agulis, the famous Azerbaijani novelist Akram Aylisli, also a witness to this destruction. You probably heard of his book, Stone Dreams. That book is not a novel. That book is not about massacres. That book documents the Armenian history of Agulis and its 8 churches, which he loved and worshipped as a Muslim Azerbaijani. He saw it as part of his heritage. Then we have Stephen Sim. You heard about him earlier today, the man who traveled throughout Turkey to document what had been left. He sneaked into Nakhichevan for a few days, and there was nothing left. There are not even ruins. There's not even dust. We have the anonymous Azerbaijani historian looking really good in the photo. Really, really good person. And then Shura Burtin, who is a independent Russian journalist who went in 2013. We also use the archival documents from Azerbaijan. The first one is from 1997. Akram Aylisti, the novelist with the mountain background, he sent a telegram to Heydar Aliyev, the president at the time in Azerbaijan, on June 10th, 1997, telling him, I've heard, he actually witnessed, but he said, I've heard that the destruction of Armenian churches and cemeteries of Agulis has started. Please stop this evil vandalism. Of course, it did not. It continued. Julfa was targeted for a while, but because of Armenian protests and the visible location on the Iranian border, the destruction did not finish until December of 2005. That was days after the order in the center by Vasif Talibov, the leader of Nakhichevan, was signed. And that order basically said, make a passport documentation of everything that is in Nakhichevan to prove that this is the land of Azerbaijani Turks. We know what that meant, and actually they admitted to it in the encyclopedia, which is the one to the right, in which they summarized the findings of the investigation. So 2 years of final destruction, and in there they say Armenians demonstrating hostility against us, and I'm not going to mock the English there, have not only laid claim against us, but also our monuments. And so the last part says, the health investigations once again proved that the land belonged to the Azerbaijani Turks, and that the historical and cultural monuments left from our forefathers for us are the seal of Azerbaijanis over this land. And so to summarize, the 89 medieval churches that Argham Ayvazyan had documented, the 5,840 cross stones, half of which were at Julfa, and 22,000 flat tombstones, many of them ornate and with incredible engraving information about the people who had passed, all of those, by 2007, they were reduced to 0. It is not out of question that there might be a few graves from the 20th century of Armenians in Nakhichevan. But the idea is not because the Azerbaijani government completely hates Armenians, they hate our history more. And so they destroyed everything that was older than the 19th century. Here's an example of one of the 89 churches, Surp Karapet, holy precursor of Abrakunis, today called Ebrekunus. And it's a church that was rebuilt several times, and most prominently in the 14th century by someone named Maghakyan Malachi of Crimea. And when Stephen Sim visited in August 2005, this is what was remained of it. And actually, here's a photograph of the unveiling of the mosque that took place there in 2013. Just so you realize this was done completely by the national government. On the very left, we have the leader of Azerbaijan's Muslim clerics who had traveled from Baku for this, and he does anything and everything that the Aliyevs tell him to. Next to him is Vasif Talibov, the leader of Nakhichevan, who is also related to the Aliyevs and does anything and everything that he is told to do. Here's the same church and a photograph done by an anonymous photographer showing the mosque. Now, to be clear, this is not a religious issue. Most of the churches have not been replaced with mosques. This is to erase the Armenian history, which happened to be Christian. Another church, another photograph by Stephen Sim and Argham Ayvazyan earlier. This is actually Tsarna. Those of you who know the history of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, who was born in Tsarna? Which founder? Rostom. So this is the birthplace of Rostom and also the birthplace of Gomidas's own ancestors. So even though we think of Gomidas as Western Armenian, his roots are in Eastern Armenia, in Nakhichevan, in Gokhtan, in Zerna. So here's a church and a photograph that shows the landmarks, and a social media photograph that shows the same landmarks, but no signs of the church. Agoulis was that famous town that Akram Ailisi wrote about. At one point it had 12 churches. Until the breakup of the Soviet Union, it had 8 churches. Here's an overlay of where they were. One of them was particularly famous. Even Azerbaijani publications like this one, earlier from the 20th century, showcased the churches. Here are the inside and the outside. On the right side, you have an inscription that tells the history of the church, or the tradition the people believed in, and that was Bartholomew the Apostle came to Armenia to preach Christianity. His co-disciple Thomas went to India, and there he was martyred. So a chapel was established by Bartholomew for St. Thomas, which became a church, later a cathedral. That's why this was called St. Thomas. Here's the interior and the exterior. Argam Ayvazyan had to be very careful to get inside the church, so he actually took a local Armenian, one of the last living Armenians in Nakhichevan, with him, and she told the local Azerbaijanis that Argam Ayvazyan had a health problem, something was wrong with his brain, and he believed that only by spending time inside the cathedral he could figure out, the problem and get cured. So they let him in, they closed the door. He actually told me, I did not write about this, he told us that he chased a chicken around the church to show that he was really crazy. I guess you gotta be crazy to spend your entire life documenting monuments. Here is another view of Agoulis with the church. St. Thomas, I actually have found a social media photo with an overlay of what it looks like today. Another mosque has replaced it. Here is actually the unveiling of the mosque. Can you spot Vasif Talibov? Or as my Azerbaijani colleague, who I cannot name, calls him Vasif Talibanov. Here's the guy in the center. He is a dictator. Nakhichevan is much worse than Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan is already one of the worst dictatorships in the world. And he does everything that the Aliyevs tell him to. Here's a photo when he had gotten the job just a few years later. Can you count the number of Heydar Aliyev photos in the room? This was a president at the time, now his son is in charge. Any guesses? I counted 6. Someone said there's gotta be a few in his pocket too, but we can't see it. There's one publication in Nakhichevan, the official news that comes out from the government, and they obviously took a note of the investigation that was published, and their response was all over the board, just calling it a bunch of names, insults, which I took as compliments because there was nothing else they could say. Only 2 factual claims they made was, one, we did not use the official names of the geographic locations. Who cares? We actually did use the official names in the captions, but that does not talk to the actual facts of the destruction. And they said that somehow those monuments had been taken out of Nakhichevan beforehand by Armenians. So good job, all of you, taking out 28,000 monuments out of Nakhichevan. Actually, 20 cross stones from Julfa have been taken out in the Soviet era, and we're very thankful to the people who did. The international media reacted. Of course, the Armenian media, this was big news there. I interviewed with pretty much every Armenian network. The Armenian diaspora took a note of the investigation. Newspapers in England, China, France, Germany, Italy were also interested. Not so much in the US, but we're very fortunate to be joined by a reporter from the LA Times today who's here to cover this investigation. And finally, last but not least, the big investigation, the big review that The Guardian did about this work. And this is actually what allowed me to use the phrase worst or greatest cultural genocide of our time. I was not too comfortable with that phrase, but I did mention it during my interview because it meets all the criteria. Of course, genocide does not have a cultural component under the current international law, but the person who championed it, Raphael Lemkin, did advocate for it, it was not included, even though he had actually classified it as crimes of vandalism along with crimes of barbarism, which was the first time he articulated the genocide crime in 1933. So this allowed me to use this term and not feel like I'm sensational, it's a sensation. But a few weeks ago, I rewatched the tapes from the destruction of Julfa, and I realized that I was not the first one to use it. In the destruction tape, Father Nishant Topuzyan actually uses the same phrase, the greatest cultural genocide of our time. And he also told me something in his last email, which was, if we don't keep speaking about this destruction, in 10 years, it will be forgotten history. He died a few months after that from a heart attack at age 44. So when I went to Iran in 2013, he was not there to join me for tea at the chai khana, or the tea house next to Julfa. But you're all here today. So I ask you to speak up and join me in telling the world about the greatest cultural genocide of our time. Thank you.